Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share, and restack buttons. Well, when this happens, people will suddenly panic. But first, I want to say thank you to everyone in the last 24 hours who has prayed for our daughter Elizabeth. As many of you know, or if you don't know, if you missed the community note on YouTube or the notes section on the Substack, Monday afternoon, excuse me, and my voice may be going through this throughout this video because of all of this, but our youngest daughter Elizabeth, she's about 4 years old. She was having some respiratory issues. We took her to the ER. She has a history of those types of issues. We thought, well, they'll give her a treatment and we'll come home. But then that turned into she was admitted to the hospital, and they told us it could be a day, it could be 2 days. But fortunately, she came home earlier today. So I'm recording this Tuesday night for Wednesday. So you're seeing this on Wednesday if you're watching it when it rolls out. But I just want to say thank you to all the many people. I know it was thousands of people who were praying. And I know also that she made a turn for the better not long after I posted those notes. So I have no doubt that it was the prayers of all the people in this audience that helped make her better. So she's happy, she's doing well. We're at home now. So thank you so much for all of your prayers. It means so much to our family. So when this happens, people will panic. What am I talking about? Well, it's a specific event that's going to take place that will cause the panic. We're going to talk in a moment about what that specific event is. First, we need to lead up to that and tell the story of why that event is inevitable. So let's start with this right here. So this article is from CNBC. It's from last Wednesday, in fact. It says, Federal Reserve, and guys, I'm going to try to read this and not laugh. It's going to be very hard. In fact, I'm already laughing already just thinking about reading the article and not laughing. But it says, the Federal Reserve says all 31 banks in annual stress test withstood a severe hypothetical downturn. Oh, no problem at all, right? No problem at all. And we're going to see what their definition is and the assumptions they're making. It's absolutely ridiculous. It says the Federal Reserve said Wednesday that the biggest banks operating in the United States would be able to withstand a severe recession scenario while maintaining their ability to lend to consumers and corporations. Each of the 31 banks in this year's regulatory exercise cleared the hurdle of being able to absorb losses while maintaining more than the minimum required capital levels, the Fed said in a statement. The stress test assumed unemployment surges to 10%, commercial real estate values plunge 40%, and housing prices fall 36%. So again, we're right now, I want to put that in perspective. So they're saying all of that happens. These 31 banks, no problem. They withstand this they're strong and stalwart in the midst of this chaos, right? Well, last year, we almost had a complete meltdown of the global banking system. We saw the second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in U.S. history against a backdrop of supposedly record levels of employment, record low levels of unemployment, and commercial real estate values that were plunging, but not as much as they have so far. And of course, we haven't seen house prices fall at all. They've been going up. So they would have us to believe that we almost saw complete meltdown of the banking system a year ago with all of that in its favor, but oh, no problem. 10% unemployment, plunging real estate values, no problem, right? So they say this year's results show that under our stress scenario, large banks would take nearly $685 billion in total hypothetical losses. Now, number may sound a little bit familiar to you. What have we been looking at? We've been looking at the FDIC's own reports for the last 2 years have stated anywhere from $400 to $700 billion in unrealized losses at U.S. banks. And that's simply based on the interest rate changes. A lot of times they're not even accounting for, well, this commercial real estate we have is worth half of what we loaned, half the amount the loan we put out for it is. So they're much worse than that. But it says, yet they still have considerably more capital than their minimum common equity requirement, said Michael Barr, the Fed's vice chair for supervision. So supposedly he's supervising all of this. Says, this is good news and underscores the usefulness of extra capital that banks have built in recent years. The Fed's stress test is an annual ritual that forces banks to maintain adequate cushions for bad loans and dictates the size of share repurchases and dividends. This year's version included giants such as JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, credit card companies including American Express, and regional lenders such as Truist. While no bank appeared to get badly tripped up by this year's exercise, which had roughly the same assumptions as the 2023 test, the group's aggregate capital levels fell 2.8 percentage points, which was worse than last year's decline. So just 2.8 points. You know, all this terrible stuff happening in the economy, no problem. That's because the industry is holding more consumer credit card loans and more corporate bonds that have been downgraded. Lending margins have also been squeezed compared to last year. So again, how did they think those consumer credit card loans and corporate bonds are going to do when we start seeing massive layoffs? Because their hypothetical scenario was 10% unemployment, which the way they measure unemployment 40, 50 years ago, when they were more honest about it, it would be like 25% unemployment. I mean, to get to 10%, the government actually reporting 10% unemployment, we're looking at depression level unemployment levels. So, but no problem for the banks. It says, while banks are well positioned to withstand the specific hypothetical recession we tested them against, the stress tests also confirmed that there are some areas to watch, Barr said. The financial system and its risk are always evolving, and we learned in the Great Recession the cost of failing to acknowledge shifting risk. Right? So in other words, there may be something we're not really accounting for. The Fed also performed what is called an exploratory analysis of funding stresses and a trading meltdown that applied to only the 8 biggest banks. We'll get to that in a moment. It says in this exercise, the companies appeared to avoid disaster. I mean, did they or did they not? Or did they appeared to, right? Despite a sudden surge in the cost of deposits combined with a recession and a scenario where 5 large hedge funds implode. So let me tell you, if one large hedge fund implodes, in all likelihood, the Fed's printing dollars to bail out the entire world. But here they have a scenario where, 5 implode, and, we have a massive recession. Oh, no problem. They lose between $70 and $85 billion. We just talked about by the FDIC's own reports, banks are sitting on $600 billion in unrealized losses. And that's just the ones they're reporting because they have to. It's even bigger than that. But under that scenario, no problem. 70, 80 billion, no problem. The results demonstrated that these banks have material exposure to hedge funds, but that they can withstand different types of trading book shocks. Banks are expected to begin announcing their latest share repurchase plans on Friday. So again, this was from Wednesday, June 26th on CNBC. Well, let's fast forward about 24 hours from then to CNBC. JP Morgan Chase says its stress test losses should be higher than what the Fed disclosed. So the Fed said, hey, look at this. All these banks did wonderful. And then JP Morgan comes out and says, they really messed up talking about our stuff. You know, it says JP Morgan Chase said late Wednesday the Federal Reserve overestimated a key measure of income for the giant bank's recent stress test, and that its losses under the exam should actually be higher than what the regulator found. The bank took the unusual step of issuing a press release minutes before midnight to disclose its response to the Fed's findings. In other words, they had to cover themselves from liability, from being sued by shareholders for not disclosing it. What a mess. And of course, as we say, they always bury the lead at the bottom. So let's cut toward the bottom of this story where we get the real story. It says the news is a wrinkle to the Federal Reserve's announcement Wednesday that all 31 of the banks in the annual exercise cleared the hurdle of being able to withstand a severe hypothetical recession while maintaining adequate capital levels and the ability to lend to consumers and corporations. Last year, Bank of America and Citigroup made similar disclosures. So last year, they were like, we don't know what the Fed's doing. Legally, we can't agree with what the Fed's saying. Saying that estimates of their own future income differed from the Fed's results. Are they talking? I guess not. But it says, banks have complained that aspects of the annual exam are opaque and that it's difficult to understand how the Fed produces some of its results. So it's difficult to understand how do they get these results? And since these banks own the Fed, you would think that they know this. Well, guys, they really understand it. They know where the Fed gets these results from. And here's where they get them from. They make them up, right? They make it up. Well, if we told people that, we had this hypothetical scenario and that the 31 banks collapsed and there was just total pandemonium across the globe, how do you think the public would react to that? Hey, let's just tell them all 31 banks, no problem. They all passed the test, right? No problem at all. We saw, if you've been watching this channel for a while, the FDIC had a war game in late 22 where they talked about this exact same thing. Well, the public has a lot more faith in the banking system than we do. They need to have that faith. It's good for them to have that faith because if they don't, well, then they're going to go take all of their cash out of the bank. And then, it gets really bad. So they're not going to tell you the truth. They're going to lie to you. They're going to make it up, right? You can't count on the Federal Reserve to tell you this stuff. And guys, it's really ridiculous to think that the scenario they outlined, 5 major hedge funds blow up, 10% unemployment. Again, with government statistics, that's really about 25% unemployment. All of these terrible things happening, no problem, right? We got it. So let's see what an objective third party might think. So this is from Florida Atlantic University from early June, so about a month ago. It says, data analysis, more banks at risk of failure as commercial real estate loans reprice. So this isn't even a hypothetical worst case scenario with hedge funds blowing up. This is just the commercial real estate repricing that we already see, that's happening right now and has been happening. We've talked about it on this channel. I'm sure you've seen news articles on it. It says, more than 60 of the largest banks in the country are at increased risk of failure due to their commercial real estate exposures, according to a data analysis from a finance expert at Florida Atlantic University. 67 banks have exposure to commercial real estate greater than 300% of their total equity. So, time out. What does that mean? Well, equity means basically what's the company worth, right? It would be like, say, for instance, as an individual, it would mean your net worth. Like, let's say, hey, I've got, $10,000 in the bank and I owe $1,000 to the credit card company, so I have $9,000 net worth. That's essentially what they're saying here for the bank is, what are your assets minus your liabilities? That's your equity. That's what the company is worth. And they have exposure to commercial real estate that's 300% of their total equity, as reported in their first quarter 2024 regulatory data. This is a very serious development for our banking system as commercial real estate loans are repricing in a high interest rate environment, said Rebel Cole, PhD at Florida Atlantic's College of Business. With commercial properties selling at serious discounts in the current market, banks eventually are going to be forced by regulators to write down those exposures. The U.S. Bank's exposure to risk from the real estate screener, a part of the banking initiative at Florida Atlantic University, measures the risk to exposure from commercial real estate at the 157 largest banks in the country with more than $10 billion in total assets each. Using publicly available data released quarterly from the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council Central Data Repository, Cole calculates each bank's total commercial real estate exposure as a percentage of the bank's total equity. Bank regulators view any ratio over 300% as excessive exposure to commercial real estate, which puts the bank at greater risk of failure. Okay, so keep that in mind. 300% or above, excessive exposure puts the bank at greater risk of failure. It says, in the first quarter of 2024, industry average benchmark for total commercial real estate exposure was 139% of total equity. Banks with less than $10 billion in total assets are facing similar risk due to their commercial real estate exposure. Among banks of any size, keep this in mind, of any size. So remember, 300% is excess exposure to commercial real estate puts the bank at risk of failure. 1,871 banks have total commercial real estate exposures greater than 300%. 1,112 have exposures greater than 400%. 551 have exposures greater than 500%, and 243 have exposures greater than 600%. He says 3 banks have failed in the past year, and now we have several candidates where their exposure to commercial real estate is over 500%. Should another bank fail, it's likely that depositors will pull their money out of these highly exposed banks, which could lead to a banking panic similar to what we saw during spring 2023. We're going to talk about, I believe that's panic is coming, but there's a specific event associated with it that we're going to get to as we walk through here. But guys, keep in mind when he's talking about this, he's just talking about this exposure to commercial real estate. That's all. As if none of this other stuff exists. He's not talking about a scenario with 10% unemployment and, higher interest rates, all of these other issues. He's simply talking about just commercial real estate, which again is happening. We're seeing that decline. He's not talking about residential home prices declining, which, by the way, are at a record high. At the peak of the real estate bubble in 2007, 2008, during that time frame that led to the great financial crisis, the median priced house was a little over 6 times. It was 6.3 times the median income, because Housing prices are a reflection of people's incomes, your ability to pay, because what's a house? It's something you live in. So the people living in it have to be able to afford it. Historically, it's a little more than 2 times income, but it hit 6.3 times income at the height of the real estate bubble 15 years ago. Right now, we're at 8 times income. So we haven't seen a decline in those prices yet, but it's coming. And yet they're saying, well, potentially, these, the 31 banks at the top, they'll be fine. Yeah. No problem whatsoever. But 1,871, might be at risk of, an excess risk of failure. The bank is at greater risk of failure if they're above 300%. And, so that means 1,871 of those banks are at greater risk of failure. No problem, right? Nothing to see here. And again, this is just with commercial real estate. But let me tell you guys, commercial real estate, that is not the problem. What's the problem? Well, the problem is the derivatives market. You may say, the derivatives market? What is a derivative? So let's look up what is a derivative. Here we have this from Forbes magazine, Forbes Advisor, they call it. It says a basic guide to financial derivatives. What are derivatives? Well, derivatives are complex financial contracts based on the value of an underlying asset, group of assets, or benchmark. These underlying assets can include stocks, bonds, commodities, currencies, interest rates, market indices, or even cryptocurrencies. It says investors can enter into derivative contracts that clearly state terms for how they or another party will respond to future changes in the value of the underlying asset. You may say, well, I'm no closer to understanding what a derivative is after reading that than I was before. So I'll put it in really simple terms. What is a derivative? Well, it's a bet, right? It's a bet. And so derivatives are a big financial casino, a global casino, where they make bets. I think that'll go down in value, right? That's what it means, that based on the value of an underlying asset, they clearly state the terms for how they'll respond to future changes. If that goes down, I'll bet you, if it goes down, I'll give you this. How much will you pay me to give you that if it does that? That's all it is. It's a bet. It's a giant bet. And guys, this is, I have to laugh at this stuff because this is what people should really be thinking about, not commercial real estate or any of these other issues they're talking about, but derivatives. Because you would go, well, okay, well, how many of these derivatives are out there, right? How many are out there? So let's take a look at this Investopedia article. How big is the derivatives market? Says, well, the derivatives market is, in a word, gigantic. Often estimated at over $1 quadrillion on the high end. And I would say that's really on the low end. And I'm gonna show evidence for why I believe that. I've heard other people say 2 to 4 quadrillion is a more accurate number. And I think you'll draw that conclusion when we look at this, but For those that can't conceive what that is, that's 1,000 times a trillion is a quadrillion, right? So how can that be? Well, largely because there are numerous derivatives in existence available on virtually every possible type of investment assets, including equities, commodities, bonds, and currency. In other words, well, they're just bets, right? Again, just bets in the casino. Now, some people, and that would be the Bank of International Settlements we're going to look at in a second, is saying, no way, Britt, there's not $1 quadrillion in derivatives. This is ridiculous. Let's let's come over and see what the Bank of International Settlements has to say. This is from May 2023. They're talking about 2022 statistics, but still nowhere near a quadrillion, Britt. They say the gross market value, again, we have to know what these words mean, but it says the gross market value of over-the-counter derivatives, summing contracts with positive and negative values, so grew by 13% in the second half to reach 20.7 trillion at year-end. So see, 20 trillion, not a quadrillion. Britt, you're making stuff up, but keep in mind what they're saying here. Gross market, well, we're just summing contracts with positive and negative values. What does that mean? Well, they offset one another, right? So what that means is, well, there may be a quadrillion, $20 trillion in derivatives, but a quadrillion of those sort of offset each other because there's, half a quadrillion here, half a quadrillion there. They're on opposite sides from one another. They just cancel each other out. No problem. There's nothing to worry about here, right? So to put in perspective, what do they mean when they say that? Well, it means this. Let's say you go, well, if my house burns down, Britt, I want you to pay me $1 million. Okay, and I say, okay, I will pay you $1 million if your house burns down, and I want you to pay me, $100,000 now, right? Hopefully your house doesn't burn down. I pocket the $100,000. But then I'm looking around and I'm going, well, now I face this huge loss of, $900,000 because I got the $100,000. But if your house burns down, I have to pay out $1 million. So I go over to Larry and I say, hey, Larry, how about I give you $80,000, and in exchange, you're going to give me $900,000 if that person's house burns down. And so now I go, well, now I have no risk because, if I have to pay you $1 million, Larry is going to pay me the difference. I'm in good shape. And then Larry, he does the same thing. He goes, well, now I have to pay this $900,000, but I'll go to Ed, and Ed will bail me out, right? So it's this big circle. Everybody's going to pay everybody else off. They all offset, right? That's essentially what they're saying here. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Again, I haven't had much rest the last couple of days, but that's essentially what they mean here. Hey, all this stuff offsets. So it's not really a quadrillion dollars in derivatives. It's just 20 trillion, right? So, as if that's not a big deal, $20 trillion. Okay, so how much really are there, and why does it matter? Well, let's take a look at this right here. This says, this is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency quarterly report on bank trading and derivatives activities. And take a look at a page out of that in a second, but just want to notice this right here. And keep note of this because we're going to revisit this in a moment. It says 4 large banks. We're not going to identify who they are here. But 4 large banks held 87.6% of the total banking industry notional amount of derivatives. 4 banks held 87.6% of total banking industry notional amount of derivatives. So in case you're not following, let's just say that I'm right. There's a quadrillion dollars in derivatives. And this is telling us that 4 banks are sitting on 87.6% of that quadrillion dollars in derivatives, which would mean 87.6 trillion, no, I'm not even doing that, $876 trillion in derivatives, which really means exposure. But again, it's not really, Britt, because they offset, right? Or do they? They do until they don't, is the answer. Because again, this is where we talk about counterparty risk. This is what we saw when Lehman Brothers failed back in 2008. That really kicked the financial crisis into overdrive because, okay, let's say I'm assuming all these things offset. I'm assuming Larry's going to pay me. Your house burns down, no problem. Larry's going to pay me. But then Larry doesn't pay me. And then I can't pay you. And nobody can pay each other. And nobody wants to lend to one another. Nobody wants to do business with one another. That's when the credit markets freeze. We've talked about what would happen when the credit markets freeze. We came within a very, very close to that happening. Back in 2008, it did not happen. But we're going to get close to that happening again, and it looks like it will happen here soon. But let's see. Okay. There's not a quadrillion, Britt. There's not a quadrillion. Well, let's go into this quarterly report, and we get to page 13, where they talk about compression activity. Oh, what in the world is compression activity? Well, that's their fancy word for offsetting these derivatives, right? So, yeah, take a half a quadrillion over here and a half a quadrillion over here, and we're going to compress them together. You just sort of push them, you compress them together, and then they equal zero, right? 500 trillion here, 500 trillion there. Put that together. It doesn't equal a quadrillion. It equals zero because they just offset each other. We call that compression. And so when we take a look at the compression activity at the banks, we'll see their quarterly compression activity in trillions of dollars. So let me underscore that. Not millions, not billions, trillions with a T. And if you go look at the latest data, so in the first 3 months of this year, that'd be January, February, March, for those who don't know, $289 trillion in derivatives. Again, what are derivatives? They're just bets. So the banks made, $289 trillion in bets over here and over there. Just picture them rolling the dice. Roll the dice here, roll the dice there. Deal the cards out here and there. $289 trillion. 4 banks are responsible for 87.6% of that. Just look at 2023. We had this up. Oh, wait. 257, 225, 215, 245 trillion. Yeah, I mean, if I add that up, it comes up probably just short of a quadrillion. But not by much, right? So, yeah. I think it's fair. And again, this is just the U.S. banks. This isn't the whole global banking system. So globally, it's probably safe to say there's $2 to $4 quadrillion in derivatives floating out in space. And there's this big casino with all the banks rolling the dice. No problem, right? They'll survive a stress test. Again, to put this in perspective, $289 trillion in derivatives or compression activity by the banks in the first quarter. To put that in perspective, what that means, let's look in Google. US GDP, gross domestic product. That means all the goods and services produced in the United States in 2022. All of them, everything produced, equaled 25.44 trillion. So, but in the first quarter we had, 11 times, maybe, 11 times that amount was just conjured into thin air by the banks, and, they're just rolling the dice. Everything's going to work out well, right? Well, this is why we hear about this quote. This is from Warren Buffett. For those who don't know, he's considered one of the most successful investors, probably the most successful investor in the history of the world. He's been among the richest men in the world for 35, 40 years now. And this is why he said derivatives are weapons, financial weapons of mass destruction. Because again, you can compress these derivatives, right? They offset each other. Don't worry, they offset each other until they don't. And that's exactly what we saw when Lehman Brothers failed. They owed large amounts of money to different financial institutions like AIG, and then, AIG, then they failed. Well, then they owed a whole bunch of other financial institutions, and we get contagion spreading through the global financial system. So again, remember, 4 banks, that report said 4 banks were responsible for 87.6% of the derivatives. That's important to note because we can look at this right here from Yahoo Finance. It says Fed faults living wills of Bank of America, Citi, Goldman, and JP Morgan. Hey, that's 4, right? I wonder if it's the same 4. Let's see. Well, this is just from a couple of weeks ago, June 21st. 4 of the biggest banks on Wall Street must improve their blueprints for a hypothetical wind down after top U.S. regulators found weaknesses in their plans. Well, what do they mean by wind down? Well, they mean if you go bankrupt, right, how are we going to unwind all this? How are we going to unravel all of this? Because there's a lot of stuff there, a lot to wind down. It took 15 years to close the books on the bankruptcy and the failure of Lehman Brothers. 15 years. So there's a lot involved in a wind down. That's why they had to produce these plans. It says the so-called living wills of JP Morgan, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup all had a, quote, shortcoming. That's a shortcoming. No problem, right? Federal Reserve and the FDIC said on Friday. I thought that these were among the 31 banks that had no problem, right? Oh, that's right. That was made up, right? I'm getting confused here. It says the regulators reviewed the most recent resolution plans, which were mandated following the '08 financial crisis. And we're going to talk about the panic event that's coming was also mandated by that crisis, or at least by the response to that crisis. It says the 4 banks with an identified shortcoming, or for the 4 banks with an identified shortcoming, the letters describe the specific weaknesses resulting in the shortcoming and the remedial actions required by the agencies. The regulators didn't identify weaknesses in the plans of Bank of New York Mellon, Wells Fargo, State Street, or JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley. Well, that would be probably, I'm just taking a guess here, that those 4 banks don't have 87.6% of the quadrillion plus dollars in derivatives that are floating out there, right? Maybe, I'm just wild guess, right? It says Bank of America, Goldman, and JP Morgan declined to comment. Wonder why. Citi said it was fully committed to addressing the issues identified by our regulators. The lenders will, quote, invest what is necessary to support this critical effort and is confident it could be resolved without taxpayer funds or negatively affecting the financial system. Wait, who said anything about that? Why are you bringing that up? Well, they're bringing that up precisely because, here we have an official denial, right? Oh, no problem. We can handle anything that comes our way, any hypothetical scenario. without taxpayer bailouts and without any impact on the global financial system, right? So, meaning very soon we're going to see Citi is going to need a taxpayer bailout, and it's going to negatively impact the entire global financial system. It says the Fed and the FDIC diverged on the significance of the problems with Citi's plan. The FDIC deemed the weakness to constitute a, quote, deficiency, a more severe finding. Because the two disagreed, Citi's weakness was deemed, quote, a shortcoming. The finding of a shortcoming doesn't result in a penalty for banks. The regulators found issues with how each of the four banks' plans dealt with derivatives. So a shortcoming, no problem. A deficiency, well, that's a problem. But a shortcoming, no problem. According to the regulators, Citi's plan could not add in updated stress scenarios and assumptions. They also said issues with data reliability contributed to inaccurate calculations regarding how much capital would be required for executing the plan. Meanwhile, JP Morgan's strategy couldn't update some economic conditions in calculating the necessary capital and liquidity to carry out its plan. Why not? It says Bank of America's living will plan wouldn't work for some derivatives transactions. Really? You don't say. Says the agent. The agent said, calling into question the firm's ability to execute it. Goldman's wind-down plan was found not to fully capture the complexity of its derivatives portfolio. The regulators made their determinations based on plans submitted in 2023. The banks with weaknesses are required to deal with them in new resolution plans due July 1st, 2025. And let me say, they may be required to deal with them in new plans due July 1st of next year. They also may be required to deal with them sooner than that. Again, these four banks, in all likelihood, are the four banks that were mentioned in that Comptroller of the Currency PDF and quarterly report, saying they're responsible for 87.6% of the financial derivatives in existence, which is in the quadrillions. And when what can't be paid isn't paid, again, everything's fine. All these things that you can compress them, they cancel each other out until they don't. And then all of these institutions are bankrupt. And then what do you have? Well, what do you have? Then you have major financial crisis that probably leads to the rollout of central bank digital currency. But probably what will lead up to this derivatives collapse is something, is a specific event. They mentioned the 2008 financial crisis led to this regulation. And we see it in the Dodd-Frank Act. It's called a bail-in. What's a bail-in? Well, if we Google it, it says a bank bail-in is a financial rescue plan that helps banks that are close to bankruptcy or collapse. It involves creditors and depositors canceling some or all of the bank's debt by reducing the value of its shares, bonds, and uninsured deposits. So keep in mind, your deposit is the bank's debt. This is different from a bailout, which is when an outside party, usually the government, uses taxpayer money to rescue the bank. Instead, a bail-in uses funds from within the bank, such as shareholders and depositors, to help it avoid failure and shift risk away from taxpayers. Well, really, it's depositors, because the shareholders, they put their capital in at the beginning in exchange for the shares. So we're not at this crisis bail-in point until that's already exhausted. So it's really the depositors that are going to be bailing in the bank. And so, guys, this is when people will suddenly panic. Most people don't know this. Most people don't know that bail-ins are the new bailouts. Most people got upset back in 2008, 2009 when all the big banks, all these financial institutions were bailed out at taxpayer expense. They said never again. Congress said, no problem. We won't have taxpayers bail out the banks. We'll have the depositors bail out the banks. How wonderful. I don't think that's what people had in mind. It says financial reforms under the Dodd-Frank Act eliminated bailouts and opened the door for bail-ins. Bail-ins allow banks to convert debt into equity to increase their capital requirements. Remember, the bank's debt is your deposit, or at least any deposit above that $250,000 threshold. But again, you may say, well, I don't have $250,000 in the bank. That's not a problem for me. But again, think of how many companies have their payroll in the millions of dollars. Maybe in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you think they've divided this up into, thousands of accounts under $250,000? No, they've probably got most, if not all of that with one bank and one bank account to pay out every 2 weeks or so. And so what happens when a bank, the first bank in the United States, receives notification, well, we're going to have a bail-in, because it's going to happen sooner or later. Just as we saw with Lehman Brothers, where they said, well, we're not going to bail this one out. We bailed out some other ones, but we're not going to bail this one out. And then the panic ensued. Well, the panic that ensues in this financial crisis will be from this. When we had the first bail-in, and it hits the news that, well, these companies went under because they had above the $250,000 limit, or these individuals who had above that limit lost everything, then you're going to have a massive, major run on all the banking institutions as people pull out their cash in an absolute panic. Once that happens, well, those 31 banks will not pass the stress test. As we saw with the Florida Atlantic University study, a couple thousand banks are already at risk of failure, increased risk of failure due to commercial real estate alone. What happens when there's a run on their deposits? When the people who know, hey, this bank is highly leveraged in commercial real estate, better get your cash out today. What happens when overnight those 2,000 banks collapse as people rush to pull their cash out? Well, we've talked about what happens when that happens. But guys, just because others panic does not mean you should panic. Make sure you're not one of them. What does the Bible say? Well, the Bible has many things to say. We'll start with Proverbs chapter 22, verse 3. It says, a prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. The Bible also says this in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 2. Send your grain across the seas, and in time profits will flow back to you. But divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risk might lie ahead. In other words, diversify. You should be diversified. Shouldn't have all your eggs in one basket. So it's fine to have a bank account. It's even better to have an account with 2 different banks, maybe a bank and a credit union. It's even better to have some cash in a can buried in the backyard like Grandma had, right? It's a good idea to diversify where you are placed with these things. It's a good idea to have a deep pantry with weeks, if not months or years of food available to you with a long shelf life. It's a good idea to diversify and make sure that you can get water from more than one source. For most people, they get water, the only place they can get water is when they turn the handle on the faucet, water comes out. What happens if you turn the handle on the faucet and water doesn't come out? Where are you going to get your water from? Those who are diversified go, oh, I'll go here. Make sure you've thought these things through. But ultimately, John 16 verse 33 says, I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. Guys, Jesus has achieved victory, so we don't need to fear the turmoil that's coming. Jesus has already won. We can have peace in him. If you seek first the kingdom of God, all these things that you need will be given to you. That's God's promise. But again, the Bible also tells us, prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. Make sure, we are talking about this danger right now. Take precautions. Because what's coming is going to be the greatest financial crisis in the history of the world. I believe there will be an even greater one during the tribulation that we read about in Revelation 6. But I don't think we're going to, if you're a born-again Christian, we aren't going to be here for that. But we could see one before then, before the rapture, that's greater than the Great Depression. And I believe we're sitting on it when we have all these banks gambling quadrillions of dollars worth of rolling the dice and gambling. And if they gamble wrong and go bankrupt, well, no problem. They'll convert their debt to equity, which means, again, their debt is our deposits. So we're set up for a massive panic and a crisis when this house of cards falls. Again, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see a bank holiday, just as we saw in 1933 was a bank holiday. Well, it's not, hey, it's the 4th of July, the bank's closed. It's a little bit more than that. It's, hey, well, the banking system is about to disintegrate and disappear. So we're going to close the banks while we reorganize, move things around, and we hope when we open them back up again that they'll still exist. And that's what we saw in 1933. It says for an entire week in March 1933, all banking transactions were suspended in an effort to stem bank failures and ultimately restore confidence in the financial system. As again, we're going to see a bail-in at some point. When we see that, I believe that will lead to widespread bank runs and panic as people panic and they start pulling their cash out of the banks. That's going to lead to a bank holiday, freezing of the credit markets, which means, again, everything stops. More so than what we saw 4 years ago during the lockdowns. Everything will stop, not permanently. A couple of weeks, I don't know, a couple of days, couple of weeks, a month, I don't know. But that means that shipments to the grocery store stop, shipments to the restaurant stop, shipments to the gas station stop. So that means you better be self-sufficient for however long that is. So make sure that you are diversified, make sure that you are a prudent person who sees the danger coming and takes precautions so that you do not suffer the consequences. Guys, all this is coming. I don't know when. Could be tomorrow. It could be 4 years from now. I don't know. I think we're getting very, very close to it. But I just don't know. But it is coming. This is a house of cards they built. It's going to fall down. So hopefully you're taking precautions and making preparations so that you aren't one of the panicked people when this happens, because this will give us an opportunity to be a witness for Jesus Christ to those around us, because when everybody else around you is panicked and they see you and you're not, they'll say, why is it that you're not panicked? And you will be able to give them an account of why you have hope in Jesus Christ and why he gives a peace that surpasses all understanding, and you can glorify your Lord and Savior. So make sure you're ready for that day, because that's a wonderful opportunity to witness to your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, everybody around you. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Again, thank you for all of the prayers for Elizabeth. She's doing much, much better now. She's very happy now to be back home and away from the hospital. I know your prayers made all the difference. So leave your comments below. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe and restack buttons. God willing, I will see you on Friday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to visit my Substack at brittgillette.substack.com. There you'll find my latest videos and articles, as well as notes, where I share the latest news headlines, the articles I'm reading, and the videos I'm watching. Subscribe for free, and each new post on Substack will be sent directly to your email. Just scroll to the bottom of the homepage and hit the subscribe button. As an added bonus, your first welcome email will include a link to a copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt Gillette on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.